Welcome. I was going to say everybody. Welcome to those of us who are here. Welcome to our audience online. It's nice to see you here. My name is Tina Fawcett, so I lead the Oxford Energy Network. And before introducing today's speaker, I will just briefly mention who we're going to hear from next week. So next week we have got Professor Pramod Bhargaonkar, probably saying his surname wrong, but he's from the University of California, Irvine, and he's visiting. He's a kind of visiting researcher in Oxford at the moment, and he's going to be speaking about AI data center growth, challenges and opportunities for electric power systems. And he's a sort of engineer by background, so that'll be really interesting because we had a talk on data centers last term as well from a sort of modelling perspective. So this is what it'd be interesting to see whether he comes up with the same conclusions or something. I would recommend that. Today's speaker is Anders Hove, who is, as it says here, is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. I'm really delighted that he's decided to come and speak to us today. He spoke last term to our energy systems master students, and it was the most popular talk in the module that I ran. So it was, really interesting topic. Anders has been involved in the energy program at OEIS. He has lived and worked in China for, I think, 12 years, he said in the bio, and was living in Beijing until 2022, and was working there, amongst other people, for the German government GIZ, Energy Transition Program. He's got lots of private and public sector experience, and really look forward to hearing what he's got to say. Thanks, Anders.
Thank you very much. There's not much additional to say, but basically 12 years in China focused on energy policy, especially power markets and renewable energy, clean energy transition, low carbon energy transition, working together with a state-owned laboratory that's part of the National Development and Reform Commission, Energy Research Institute of NDRC, based in Beijing, and then the German government and several think tanks in Germany would cooperate with that think tank in China to develop models of what the future energy system of China would look like, and also contribute to forums and discussions with policymakers, especially under the National Energy Administration, talking about ongoing electric power market reforms, renewables, these sorts of topics. And the reason why all of that got going in the first place is that a lot of policies, but especially in the renewable field in China, actually had some background that came from German energy policy, especially the Renewable Energy Law, or EEG, in Germany. That was adopted in China, essentially a translation of the German text into Chinese law as the Renewable Energy Law feed-in tariff, starting for wind in 2009 and for solar in 2011. And there were some jokes. This is anecdotal, so obviously I can't give you a citation, but there was some joking that initially, when the law was adopted for wind, SOE companies would call the government with questions about how to interpret this new regulation of feed-in tariff, and the NEA would refer these calls to the German embassy. Of course, Chinese regulations, Chinese laws often tend to be written in a much more general way and less specific, and are more open to interpretation. So that story might not be that accurate, but it's a joke that was around among the German side anyway. I want to talk a little bit about how China is the most innovative, how it's the most successful at scaling up the clean energy industry, any country in the world, any region in the world, any geography in the world. And this is the organization of the topics that I'm going to discuss. This is all written down with a lot of citations in a paper that I wrote more than 2 years ago, Fact and Fiction paper. You can search my name, Fact and Fiction, Oxford. And you'll get to that paper. It's all about the factors that explain why China became so innovative in the clean energy space, and somewhat what extent that those factors might be replicable elsewhere, which I think that they're more replicable. I'll try not to say that word again. They're more copyable than we might think, even though, of course, nobody can match the scale of China. But before that, I want to discuss a little bit framing of how I see Chinese energy policy and how it fits into the way the state is organized. Because whenever we talk about China outside of China, usually we talk about the state and the government first. And also in this presentation, I'm going to start with the state. And I realized as I was walking over here, I'm going to also end with the state. So it's kind of by accident, but I do emphasize in this presentation that the state is only one factor. Policy is only one factor. So yeah, starting off with the framing, I want to, without just first starting with China and describing what China is, what Chinese energy policy is, what Chinese clean energy policy is, and how that's structured, I think it's important to contrast that with the stereotype or the model, if you will, of what I'm labeling here as the Washington Consensus. And this is not a full or accurate description of what the Washington Consensus means in other contexts. It includes some things that are slightly outside of the Washington Consensus, and but generally speaking, the idea that the policy is there to address market failures. The market is helping not only guide short-term decisions in energy markets, energy trading, but also their prices, markets, innovation, help establish long-term investment trends and guide long-term investment trends. And government is helping out along the side to address market failures, especially funding extremely long-range basic science, R&D, things that private sector probably wouldn't be capable of doing, and not picking technological winners, keeping everything market neutral so that all the players can have fair competition, and engaging in trade, because this is a way for advanced economies, countries that are most advanced, to retain control over the top scientific achievements that lead to the highest value in all fields, whereas through trade, through a disaggregation of production, manufacturing offshore, we leave it to private companies to figure out which are the low margin activities that could be sent to other geographies. And in the China model, I think it's not diametrically different, but it is, I did emphasize the differences in this slide, that the state plays a very central role in identifying strategic and emerging industries as they were labeled starting a couple decades ago. And then the state, by designating these strategic emerging industries, helps guide investment into those fields, especially through the state-owned banking sector, also through state-owned enterprises, also through local governments who realize that they can achieve more investment, more economic growth in the short term by targeting these strategic emerging industries for growth. And that market mechanisms are important, obviously, since reform and opening began in the late 1970s, but continuing till today, market forces, market mechanisms in the energy sector help guide short-term decision-making to optimize the distribution of resources, but they play less of a role and are not necessarily intended to guide long-term investment decisions. And local governments take these signals from the central government to decide which areas to target, not only target for investment, trying to attract companies into those fields, but also trying to figure out how can we build local industrial strength, comparative advantage within China. How can we figure out how to build something unique and economically powerful within China that will be, to some extent, a local strength as opposed to a national strength. And within that strategy, typically the result is excess capacity nationally and also hyper competition inside local areas among many different players, not necessarily state-owned players. And this is quite different from, I think, the stereotype of how China's state capitalism works. And then trade, of course, is managed to very much encourage localization of technologies into China, as well as into local areas. So getting to the topic of innovation, which is why we are here, I wanted not to invent my own framework for evaluating China's innovation system, but to use another framework that other scholars came up with. And I think this is a pretty widely used one, the technology innovation system of Heckert and Burgeck from a couple decades ago. And I didn't come up with this order. This isn't the order of my presentation. This is from one of them. I don't remember which one, but essentially these are the categories, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive categories, but entrepreneurial activities I'm going to mention, knowledge development and knowledge networks. So knowledge development, often in the media, you hear about China's leading now in patenting, including clean energy, obviously. R&D spending, very hard to measure objectively, but China has also increased its R&D spending quite a bit, higher percentage than other countries, other advanced economies by some measures. Workforce, China has more engineers, scientists than any other country because it's so large, but even beyond that, it's quite a large scientific and technical engineering workforce. Guidance of search. So this is kind of a jargony expression, but this is kind of where I put the policy side. So in the media, we often hear about China subsidizing, but I think this is actually the most critical aspect of policy, which is guidance of which areas the private sector or SOEs or mixed ownership companies and local governments will send resources towards. That's a critical area of innovation, because without that guidance, the new technologies will not receive adequate investment to essentially be commercialized and scaled up, which is critical in the energy sector because energy is capital intensive in the first place. Market formation, China, by virtue of low interest rates, especially state-owned companies and state-owned banks, and especially for infrastructure, that creates a distortion in the Chinese economy, which is good for energy investing because basically there is going to be a large amount of energy investing relative to other countries. It's favored due to the structure of capital markets. It's not just benefiting SOEs, it's also benefiting private and startups. And you can say that, you know, the United States has this tilt or distortion in favor of venture capital supported industry. Whatever venture capital is really hot on right now, they will have this artificially low cost of capital, right? So people, my joke is that companies in China can remain in overcapacity for longer than you can remain solvent. The same would be true for like the Amazons or internet startups of Silicon Valley. This exists in multiple regions. It's that the distortion is in favor of large capital-intensive infrastructure in China. Resource mobilization, this is where I would put those government subsidies, as well as SOEs with their soft government budget constraint. And then legitimacy goes back to the strategic emerging industries. Policy, I want to emphasize that China does have a lot of supportive policies for domestic deployment of clean energy, and each of the areas that I have studied has differed in which instruments China used. So it's hard to generalize both about the national government and the regional governments, local governments. For wind power and PV, as I already was mentioning, the feed-in tariff was one of the primary subsidy mechanisms that China used. That was primarily adopted from Western models. Not just Germany had a feed-in tariff, but other European countries also used the feed-in tariff. Subsequently, after the feed-in tariff was dropped, China now has a renewable obligation, similar to some other countries. Sometimes American observers refer to the renewable obligation as a renewable portfolio standard. I don't think it's quite an accurate comparison. However, many of the support mechanisms for wind and PV clearly adopted from Western models, and the amount of subsidy as well, similar to those. So I would emphasize that over, for example, 5-year plans, where 5-year plans, research has shown that targets for renewables often dramatically lag the running rate of installation numbers. They're not so much guiding the investment as subsidy levels and price levels. Batteries, long-term policies were really critical here because essentially there were localization requirements. In addition, you had subsidies for electric vehicles, as well as a new energy vehicle that refers to EVs and plug-in hybrid vehicles, quotas for the amount of NEVs that should be in the fleet domestically in annual new car sales. And here again, it is quite notable that the NEV policy, including even its name, is quite similar, including the formula for calculating the quota based on extra credits for certain types of vehicles, fuel cells, plug-in hybrids, and so forth. That formula is almost identical to the California zero emissions vehicle. The subsidy level for EVs was also set at a level quite similar initially to the $7,000 US tax credit for electric vehicle purchases. And those subsidies have somewhat gone away. When we read about policy in China, I do think that we tend to assume that the subsidies are somehow being paid to the factories, the production side. Most of these policies are aimed at deploying these technologies domestically, and the subsidies are, if not exactly going to consumers per se, in the case of wind and solar, they're not going to the manufacturers necessarily. It doesn't mean that manufacturers wouldn't receive a lot of support. I mentioned the low cost of capital before, but the big subsidy numbers that you might read about in the FT, for example, those would be calculated based on these items that I showed. So how did China become so dominant in these technologies? Obviously, you can subsidize something, but if China didn't originally have this technology, how did that come about? How did that transfer come about? I often tell the story about when I first went to China in 2010, I went to a lot of meetings with scientists, government officials, and Western equivalents. And when wind and solar would come up, the Chinese side would frequently mention that wind power was a very well-suited technology to China based on its cost and its scale. However, solar, the Chinese solar industry was only geared for manufacturing solar for export. This technology was not appropriate for China unless there could be technology transfer from a Western country to China that would enable the cost to radically down. That was in 2010. In 2011, the feed-in tariff was introduced. Solar took off very rapidly. And nobody came to me afterwards and said, you know, we were wrong about that. We didn't actually need any technology transfer. Turns out that we were able to deploy the conventional existing technology already being manufactured in China at scale in China with no particular problem. So how was technology transfer achieved in the first place? Again, each technology was dramatically different. For wind power, there was a localization requirement as part of the Clean Development Mechanism under the UN FCCC. That requirement essentially led most Western players to initially establish manufacturing centers in China while retaining control of the design of wind turbines in European and in United States, although mostly European, I think. For PV, it was quite different, where essentially the manufacturers of turnkey manufacturing lines took those manufacturing lines and sold them to Chinese companies and sent their own staff, consultants, to the Chinese manufacturing companies to set up those manufacturing lines, explain how to maintain them, explain where to obtain parts, and essentially train up these customers on how to manufacture solar with these turnkey production lines that they believed would continue to be manufactured in either Europe or the United States. A similar process with batteries, very clearly a modular type of technology that's built on a turnkey production line. Local content requirements were especially important for EVs, where if you wanted to receive the subsidy I mentioned for EVs, there had to be local content, and I'm going to come back to this. EVs, interestingly, started out, with this JV requirement, which you still hear mentioned as a type of trade barrier. And within China, and especially within the car industry, the JV requirement has generally been seen as a complete failure in terms of encouraging any kind of technology transfer or innovation or learning. Essentially, the state-owned companies that partnered with these Western automakers, they would just let the Western companies make a lot of profit. They would sell the cars, take a little cut, and not attempt to transfer the technology, not attempt to learn. And most of the learning that took place was kind of indigenous in the sense of not coming from SOEs that were partnered with Western firms, but from startups like that about, like BYD, not state-owned company. So this points to the differences between technologies, that basically each technology has unique characteristics that make it, first of all, more and more complex or more modular. So that's sort of talking about the size and its interaction with other parts of the system. And then the degree to which it is manufacturing intensive versus design intensive, or both. And it's sort of common sense. You can just picture that a nuclear power plant is going to be much more design intensive than a solar panel that's just a piece of metal on your roof and with some wires attached. Batteries, same thing. We've all had batteries our entire lives, no matter what our age. They basically are the same thing. Might be just different chemistry, but it's a static object that you can manufacture at volume. That's always been the case throughout all of our lives. And the difference is really critical in determining how technology transfer and innovation would work. Design intensive products and complex product systems like hydrogen, for example, which has to go through pipelines and has to be made from other energy sources, has to be consumed on the user's end. Those technologies really lend themselves to one or a small number of advanced engines dominating that technology for an extremely long period, potentially centuries, because it's very difficult for the intellectual property, the design knowledge to escape the firms that are knowledgeable about those. And also because the interaction between monopoly functions like pipelines requires that you have good local government relations to keep them all maintained. Manufacturing is the opposite. You manufacture this thing, you send it out of the factory gate, you don't care what happens to it. It's gone. All you need to know is how to scale up that factory to beat all your competition on cost and beat them to the market with the most reliable thing. And it can look exactly like your competition's things. Ideally, you should all have the same form factors so that your thing can plug into the car just as easily as your competitors. So PV, to a lesser extent, batteries, they are the most manufacturing intensive goods. And I put on the high-end nuclear internal combustion engines, much more design intensive. Now, EVs are similar in the sense that they're more design intensive than a battery or a solar cell. But relatively speaking, all of the clean energy technologies are less design intensive and more manufacturing intensive than the technologies that they replaced. And fundamentally, this means that the critical factor in innovation tends to shift away from intellectual property and basic science, basic research, and towards know-how and tacit learning. That's the type of learning that you wouldn't patent. It's the type of learning that you wouldn't necessarily be dependent on an R&D budget per se. It might not even be classified as research and development in the first place. Tacit learning can be anything from figuring out how to arrange the machines on the factory floor, knowing which parts to put in the closet for later because they're kind of hard to obtain, knowing which suppliers are reliable, knowing where their offices are so I know how long it takes their stuff to get here. That's kind of like the shallow end of learning, tacit knowledge, but more of the high end of tacit knowledge, you could say, like, what are the latest developments? What's a promising area of economic opportunity if I make this one part or widget that is used in the manufacturing of this product? If I'm located near other people, if I'm interacting with those other people very frequently, I will get that knowledge. As Alfred Marshall said, it is free as if in the air. The secrets of the trade are no secrets. So again, when I came to China, 2010, there was very little domestic deployment of solar energy. So now clean energy revolution in China has been going on for so long, we take it for granted, like it sort of always existed, but no, it did not. And it's somewhat of a hockey stick that you can see it's still continuing. But the point I want to make with these slides is that the key element to China's innovation success in these manufacturing intensive fields was scale. Kind of obvious, China would have scale, but specifically domestic deployment at scale helped Chinese manufacturers of these goods scale up quickly, compete with each other fiercely to lower their costs, and grab this domestic market first. That was probably more critical than the technology transfer per se, was the existence of this extremely large domestic market, which took the government completely by surprise. The policymakers that adopted the feed-in tariffs were basically rushed into reducing those feed-in tariffs as quickly as possible because they realized that they must have been set too generously. It's growing more quickly than we thought. There was a period from 2011 to 2013 when the government was raising its target for the 5-year plan for solar energy. Like every 6 months, they would raise the target in the 5-year plan. And it was always lagging what was going on in the market. And that's still true now. The targets for renewables are not in any way guiding above the present rate of installations. Same thing true in the EV sector. EV sector much more recent, however, and you see that. I think this is one of my favorite graphs because we would tend to focus on this part, but isn't it interesting how the EV share was just flat until 2019? And I happened to be working for GIZ when there were some meetings between the Chinese government and the German government, which was keen to lobby against this new energy vehicle requirement. And the German side said, well, the thing is, you're going to have this quota for new energy vehicles. And we can tell you that's just not going to work out for China at all. It's not going to be advantageous because you are going to force both foreign automakers and domestic automakers to build a lot of these vehicles, but then we are going to bury you in 3 or 4 years because we're working on the next greatest thing. And that's going to be, we're not ready to do that now, but we are going to be ready to compete with you in 3 years. And basically that turned out to be wrong. Why? Well, because essentially by scaling up manufacturing of batteries domestically and EVs domestically, some of the companies that were making low quality EVs for the domestic market in 2019, by 2023, they were already making high quality EVs for the domestic market because there was rapid learning on batteries and EV manufacturing techniques that enabled their costs to come down quite sharply and again dramatically exceed the government target. So the target that the government set and never updated for 2025 was that by 2025 EVs should achieve 20% of the domestic market. So again, when we talk about 5-year plan, it's all in the 5-year plan. I emphasize the 5-year plan is usually a lagging indicator of trends that are underway or expected. It is often a compendium of the expectations that the industry itself has. Another point on policy that is often raised for China is the success of pilot programs. And I think that this is a mixed success. There are examples of failures of pilot programs and also of success. And in the case of the downsides of pilot programs, when the government does designate strategic emerging industries, localities compete to be a part of these pilots because they see them as an opportunity to develop the reputation of local officials, as well as to gather resources and investment that will help their promotion possibilities. And that can result in copycat strategies. It can result in bad investment decisions, that picking industries that were not suited to that local area. It can result in overcapacity when too many projects are developed, too many companies are encouraged to enter these strategic emerging industries, and some of them end up going bust because they weren't competitive. They chose unwisely, let's say. And there was a great study of this, which I cite in my paper of Baoding, which was one of these like low carbon cities. I think they were called green cities back in 2010, 2012 timeframe. And a lot of times the cities will choose very short turnaround projects that can basically be installed in the next couple of years. Think about the phrase like shovel-ready projects. And that sometimes leads to malinvestment. So the case of Baoding, where the green city designation resulted in a lot of solar-powered lamp posts that were then ripped out a couple of years later when they all broke, and things like that. There's a lot of other examples like that. But there are obviously some advantages, and those advantages are the ones that we most often cite. Experimentation, for example, figuring out which industries are actually likely to be successful and then doubling down on those. And I think the Chinese government, central government, has over the years, especially in the energy field, come to understand that just designating a pilot is not enough. It's also useful to have very clear incentives and to designate the pilots that are most likely to be successful. And I think the best model for this is the case of the EV pilots, NEV pilots, where cities were selected based on certain criteria. First of all, you had to show that you already had some auto manufacturing in your city. Well, a lot of regions have that. Secondly, you had to also show that you already had some charging infrastructure installed, and you had to show that you already had some local policies that were encouraging local adoption of NEVs. And then after a couple of years, if you didn't progress on each one of those things, then you could be dropped out of that pilot program. And then if you're one of the officials who proposed that, then you're not going to look good. And that would, of course, be a very big motivating factor for the people who were participating in this pilot to actually make it work out and to follow through with supportive policies on the deployment side. And I think you can just contrast that with the policies to promote electric vehicles that might be proposed and I'm an American, so I think about like, what's the state that's famous for EVs in the United States? It's California, it's not Michigan. And the US government has policies to promote EVs. Are those policies targeting certain regions to adopt them first based on these characteristics? No, everybody has a chance to get an EV. And if you want to apply for funding for charging infrastructure, maybe we'll target places that are kind of missing that infrastructure instead of targeting the places that are already doing really well, and have the chance to kind of like reach an inflection point, let's say. Okay, now turning to the, almost running out of time, but turning to the private sector, you know, really, and this is here, obviously another case where policy is involved. I think it's very striking how industrial clusters are a key aspect of the development of the clean energy industry in China. And this does go along with the idea of tacit knowledge, manufacturing base, supply chain integration being really important in these manufacturing intensive fields. And a lot of times, even with clean energy, where it's obvious that China is a technological leader, not just a low-cost manufacturer, there is this stereotype that China is just this low-cost manufacturer, and the reason why prices are so low, low labor costs, low energy costs, subsidies, right? And if that was the theory, would you predict that almost all the manufacturing would be located in the most expensive provinces of China? I don't think that you would, okay? And I think it's also striking how the really dark-colored provinces there have a very high overlap with the provinces that were selected to be the special economic zones under reform and opening going back to the 1970s. Contract manufacturing, bringing in talent in research and engineering, including returning Chinese talent to those provinces, opening up those provinces to investment from Japanese, Taiwanese, and other Asian entrepreneurs to set up contract manufacturing, not just in toys and clothing, but also in electronics. And it seems to me fairly clear that it's the electronics manufacturing supply chains that gave these regions a leg up when it came to becoming the main clusters for both solar and EVs and batteries. Of course, BYD, located in Guangdong province, they specifically started out as a contract manufacturer of things like pagers and cell phones. And they decided, in order to be good at this, in order to beat our competition, we must have in-house knowledge about all the parts that are going into these devices, not just the one little part that we are being asked to manufacture. And we must figure out, even if it's not in-house, we must figure out somebody nearby to make that for us, so that we can fix it when it's wrong. The same thing is true for other people that don't have that integration philosophy. Trina, I put on this list because they, at their headquarters, have a model of the region, Jiangsu, Shanghai, and Zhejiang, showing a little flag for each one of their suppliers, and all of their suppliers are within 50 miles of their headquarters, right? CATL, similarly, this is another area where the local sharing of knowledge is very important. When CATL was, the first ATL was founded in 1999, but when CATL was refounded after it effectively had already become a successful company, but in Japan, when it was refounded in China, the government decided to open up a battery patent office directly across the street from their headquarters in Ningbo. So, you know, a way for people who are knowledgeable about this field to all cluster in the same place. Shanghai, different strategy, different type of cluster, where they encouraged Tesla to locate in Shanghai, eliminated the JV requirement, and many observers from abroad have pointed out, well, and they also forced Tesla to buy local parts, and you know that was a big trade barrier. The way I would look at it is a little bit different, which is the local government made them an offer they couldn't refuse, which is, how about you come here and make cars? We'll build you a factory in less than a year, and tell you what, you don't have to buy stuff from Shanghai. But how about we just move all the parts manufacturers directly across the street from you, and they're going to compete to offer their parts to you. How about that? Will that work for you? And it definitely did. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So this process of learning by doing, tacit knowledge transfer, it takes a long time. So when we hear about investments in Hungary or Brazil of BYD and other Chinese companies, a lot of times the early experiences are not good, and what you hear is, yeah, you know, it's all being done by Chinese, and this is just assembly. It's not, nothing is actually happening here. And that was the story with China about 15 years ago. In 2011, Alan Goodrich of National Renewable Energy Laboratory wrote a great report that showed, yeah, China already today dominates global solar manufacturing, but guess what? We have an even trade balance with China. US and China, totally even trade balance. We make the high-end tools. We are on this part of the smile curve. China is low value, low margin commodity goods. 2017 Jeffrey Ball report talked about how, yeah, that was still basically true. The parts that were made by Chinese companies broke down more frequently. The Chinese manufacturers would report, yes, we use both the high-end tools that are coming from Meyer Burger and also the United States, but and they're better. But they're 30% more expensive. And also, when the Chinese parts break down, we just call them up and they just come over here. So we use both. And by 2022, the IEA basically reports that it's already over, game over, all of the high-end tools being manufactured in China. So tacit learning, manufacturing intensive goods, what sort of companies are good at entering these new markets and encouraging innovation in these fields? Now, this is not all of the main solar companies that started up in the heyday of solar startups back in 2010 through 2015 in China. I just emphasize these four because they illustrate an important point. All of these four very large, very successful. Yingli is bankrupt now, but at the time they were very successful in scaling up extremely rapidly solar manufacturing. And were the founders known as top researchers? Did these companies come out of top science laboratories? Did they use the most advanced solar technology or the most advanced equipment? They did not. Their founders came from detergent, cosmetics, firefighting equipment, chemical protective clothing. And it's not even necessarily related to electronics sector. But each of these founders said that although they did not know anything about the electronics industry, they knew a lot about procuring in the electronics space, and they knew a lot about how to set up manufacturing lines. And that was what enabled them to jump in and say, okay, strategic emerging industry, this could be a good opportunity for me. That could be the next thing. I'm not restricted to chemical protective gloves and firefighting equipment. Now, there were obviously some other cases, but they're the minority. These people, founders who jumped in with a manufacturing background, were clearly the dominant feature of the solar field. And this extends also to their top leadership, not just, Jinko has a lot of the records now for solar conversion efficiency, so it didn't inhibit them from being leaders technologically either. BYD, I already sort of mentioned the story there, but yeah, focusing on mastering the manufacturing of electronics. Geely, I think, is one of the most interesting, stories, kind of rags to riches stories of the EV space. But essentially, to get a car startup going, Li Shufu, he basically he needed a license to manufacture cars, and to get a license to manufacture cars in China, you kind of had to be an SOE. So he kind of went looking around and found out that there was this prison that had, during the Cultural Revolution, the prisoners had been making trucks, and they still had a license to make trucks. So he took over this former prison to get their auto manufacturing license, and that was the original, sort of founding story of Geely. Now, Raman Zeng has a PhD in physics, and his PhD focuses on battery physics. However, he got his PhD after he already had more than 20 years of manufacturing experience. Okay, he had worked at a Saito & Company. He had founded ATL way before he went to get his PhD. He'd sold it to LDK, and then CATL came after that. So even the case of somebody who's clearly, he famously said, it's interesting that Elon Musk doesn't know much about batteries. It's interesting that he himself may be much more of a battery expert than Elon Musk, but he is also a manufacturing expert. The US, solar industry and also the German car companies, a lot of times I think that they are focused on, okay, what's the next technology? What's the breakthrough innovation? Maybe because we're falling behind now, we can find out what the next breakthrough innovation is, and then we can get there first. We can leapfrog by identifying that science and technology base that will enable us to compete. And I saw that when I was working on Wall Street before I went to China, where all of the solar companies were pursuing thin films as the next big thing. Conventional crystalline silicon would not succeed. It would never get below $1 per watt. It was at the time $3.50 per watt. It just energetically, it could not be done. And so the world would inevitably go towards the thin film. Solar would be the future. Then when all those companies went bankrupt around 2009 during the financial crisis, some of them were sold to China, but the point is that thin film never really panned out. And it turned out to be that it was the conventional technology and the companies that knew how to make the conventional technologies at scale that were able to achieve incremental advances within that field. So the solar panels look the same now. It still seems like the same old thing, but I think that not only the efficiency will tell you, but also the cost decline will tell you that it's actually a substantially more advanced technologically than before. You have the same chemistry underlying it, but the processes for making the cells are different. You have bifacial solar, which is not anything that sophisticated and conceptually not as sexy as these thin film materials for sure, but basically it's an incremental improvement that radically decreases the cost. And I think that this is what you see now in the past 5 years with the success of lithium iron phosphate batteries, where it was a technology that was considered like, well, that's the old technology, that's the lower energy density technology. We, Western companies that invented this technology, we don't think that it will succeed. The next big thing is actually this NMC technology, or lithium, nickel, cobalt, aluminum for Tesla. That's going to be the next thing. We have to figure out the way to improve that. Where's the technology frontier? But actually manufacturing the cheaper technology, LFP technology at scale, turned out to be what gave the Chinese companies the big advantage. So that has gone from 30% of the market just a few years ago in China to 65% now because of that cost decline. And again, this is where I emphasize the role of incremental learning, tacit learning. And I think that that's being seen now with sodium ion, where, okay, it's a lower energy density, but it has some advantage. It's a good substitute. One of the features of both LFP and NMC, LFP technology and sodium ion technology, is that whether or not they're on government catalogs for new technologies, it shows the power of the intense domestic competition in China to scale up rapidly. So we've been concerned in Western countries about China's dominance of critical minerals for more than 5 years, maybe as long as a decade. That's been a hot topic. Cobalt 10 years ago, big hot topic. Where's the cobalt? Well, if you're a Chinese company trying to scale up quickly, you're just as worried about that. You don't want to be the last one in line for critical minerals when you're trying to scale up rapidly. So you try to diversify your portfolio and develop other technologies that could be successful in case you might be the last one in line for cobalt this year. And that's why LFP scaled up, not because of some grand strategy to pursue it nationally. And the same thing is being true for sodium ion. Chinese companies going abroad, pursuing very similar strategies, investing in clusters of integrated manufacturing, trying to develop local skills, local knowledge, including Central Europe, where CATL said, we don't want to bring the parts from China. We can't get these parts in Germany. So we're going to tell you what, we're just going to invest more than €1 billion in local battery manufacturing tech startups to try to get ourselves some good supply of parts and equipment here. And, that's somewhat encouraged by local Industrial Accelerator Act and things like that. But a lot of times the view on this is kind of like, well, hold on, what's going on? This is suspicious. Don't know if we should let those guys in. They're our competitors, right? I think it's also very revealing and this is coming to the end, by the way. It's very revealing the Chinese government's own view on this point of technology transfer. If technology transfer was pretty much hard or impossible, and if the China scale was something that nobody else could ever compete with, there would be no need for this type of export restriction. So if you look at this, was adopted late last year, October, lithium ion battery manufacturing equipment, winding machines, stacking machines, electrolyte injection machines, hot presses, capacity sorting. So if it was all about IP, would it be about protecting the types of equipment that batteries have been made on for decades? Right? And so it's not that there's some high technology, some IP, some invention, some new technology, or some new chemistry that's the key thing that is being sort of protected here. It's that China, through scaling up manufacturing and through intense local competition, has, and I'll just give a couple examples, winding machines that can produce with greater precision and accuracy over a long period of time without even so much as 1 micron of drift of that reel. And you know, you've always tried to, you've all your life tried to wrap up the wrapping paper roll. You know, if you don't get it just perfect, there'll be a crinkle, and that will be on your presents next year. Getting the winding machines to wind extremely quickly and extremely precisely over a long period of operation is critical to high yields and low quality problems. Even something as simple as the stacking machine, this is another thing where if you're putting down layers, you have to get extremely precise to make sure that you're not wasting material and to make sure that you don't have quality imperfections. If each layer has, if one layer out of a million has like a tiny micron-sized bubble, then that whole battery is gone, right? And that the same thing goes down for each one of these things where, you know, getting the perfect temperature in the kiln, that is not something that is a patent. That is know-how and knowledge. And it's something that would be built into a turnkey production line that could potentially be re-engineered. So yeah, I'll summarize very quickly. There's lower barriers to entry in manufacturing intensive fields. A lot of the policies adopted in China to scale up these fields, focusing on domestic deployment, rapid scale up, not always effective. On the other hand, advanced economies do have some very big disadvantages here. Technology lock-in, reluctance to try to compete in fields that are perceived that these countries don't have comparative advantage in. If you agree with my idea that manufacturing intensive goods work best in economic clusters with related industries, is Mario Draghi correct in saying that Europe should just give up on solar and just go for high-end batteries? Or would it be better to try to develop all the related technologies locally, even if they maybe don't have a comparative advantage here? And I think that, you know, the Washington Consensus is dead. Whether it's been murdered or just died a natural death is open to discussion, but it's clear that industrial policy is here to stay. But are we learning the right lessons for industrial policy? That, I think, is what is unclear to me. And definitely in discussions that we have with policymakers, there's a lot of pessimism where it's just like, well, we just can't compete. We can never beat the China price unless we do something with, can we make these parts in Morocco? You know, will that work out? And Mexico. You know, one day it's Mexico and the next day it's not. But yeah, so I think that's my message. I hope that you found something to agree with in this presentation. I did say a lot, and so I'm not assuming that you agreed with everything. Feel free to contest or raise examples that contradict. I'm eager to hear.